In a deep, grimy dungeon, a swarm of monster-like creatures was chasing a nerdy guy in specs who looked like he got lost on the way to Comic-Con. He was sprinting for his life, flailing like a confused penguin, wondering how the heck Head ended up here. After meeting a dragon, falling off a cliff, getting slapped around by a mutant squid, and somehow riding a dragon like it was public transport. Not long ago, he was just your average, unemployed guy in his 30s whose biggest battle was getting out of bed. Now, he was questioning everything. His sanity, his luck, and most of all, who the heck cursed him with this ridiculous fate. Flashback to the past. The same guy, but with less belly and fewer bruises, was sitting at his desk on Earth, staring blankly at his PC. Out of nowhere, a sketchy pop-up appeared, offering a second chance at life. He scoffed. Reality isn't a game, he thought, but also, okay, but like, what if it was? As he mulled things over, the man, nicknamed Whisper because life thought loser was too obvious, summed up his existence in 3 sad sentences. Raised in an orphanage, worked in a factory, now 30 and juggling part-time jobs while flunking the civil service exam. That was it. The highlight of his grayscale life? A game called Godforsaken World, a place even God rage quit. Head played it for over a decade and knew every exploit, glitch, and pixel like it was his only friend. In 3 decades, all he owned was a tiny apartment in that game. If life had a walkthrough, he sighed, maybe I wouldn't be stuck on level pathetic. Just then, a pop-up appeared, and an unknown guy named Goddog messaged him with, "Want a second life?" Whisper squinted at the screen, smirked, and thought, this guy's clearly got nothing better to do. Then again, neither do I. He considered replying. Goddog messaged again, now sounding all dramatic. It won't be easy. Whisper rolled his eyes. First you're weird, now you're mysterious? Pick a personality, man, he muttered. Already bored, wondering if ignoring Goddog was the real winning move. Whisper hit enter and typed, anything's better than this train wreck of a life. Goddog replied, sounds good. That was it. Whisper blinked. Wait, that's the whole conversation. No dramatic speech, no contract in blood, just a thumbs up emoji and vibes. Before he could roast the absurdity, a deep, menacing voice echoed in his head. This is not nonsense. Whisper froze. New voice, who dis? The creepy voice kept going, telling him to try to survive this time. Great. Now, he was getting motivational quotes from demons. And before he could even say, unsubscribe, poof, he vanished. Next thing he knew, Whisper was somewhere pitch black, couldn't see squat, face itchy, hands tied, and very confused. What's on my face? Why are my hands tied? Wait, did I just get kidnapped? Panic set in. Is this organ harvesting? Why me? I have nothing that won't accept maybe debt and disappointment. Just as Whisper was spiraling into full organ harvest panic, the cloth over his head was yanked off. And boom, he was surrounded by a bunch of serious-looking dudes with medieval cosplay energy. One of them grinned and said, welcome back, third prince of the Vault Magic Empire, Gilrishan Elro de Vault. Whisper blinked. Third what now? He looked down. He was flabby, greasy, and looked like Head just lost a fight with a deep fryer. Definitely not his usual, could pass for human look. As his inner gamer screamed, I am in the game. The thug confirmed, yeah, it's definitely him. The face matches. Gilrishan was freaking out, but also kind of impressed. The whole thing felt like a dream. Or at least one of those weirdly detailed gamer fever dreams. The man then gave him a final warning. Don't try anything funny. Third prince. Gilrishan thought, buddy, I barely understand what's happening. Comedy's the last thing on my to-do list. Gilrishan, at that moment, blinked hard. Why was this random man calling him the third prince? Was this some twisted prank by a fantasy world on steroids? The man turned to leave, but casually dropped. You're getting executed today in the name of the Republic. Head's going to daddy. Gilrishan stared wide-eyed. Executed? He stammered, trying to explain there had to be some mistake. But before he could finish, the guy whipped out a sword and parked it next to his throat like it was a parking spot. Don't try anything stupid, the man said. Even if you're a useless prince, you've still got imperial blood. Your chopped-up body will at least give the emperor something to cry about. Gilrishan, now sweating bullets, thought, this is a prank. Has to be. There's no way I'm suddenly royalty. Gilrishan Elro de Vault, third prince of the Vault Magic Empire, better known as the Pig Prince. A royal joke who dropped out of the succession race for being a lazy weirdo. He was the background character of his own life. No fame, no future, and now apparently no head. As Gilrishin processed everything, one absurd thought hit him like a brick. If I'm the NPC, then who the hell is the player? Before he could spiral further, the sword guy piped up again. Any last words? Gilrishin, full-blown panicking now, blurted out, "I have no idea what's going on, but I swear I'm not the third prince." The man scoffed. "Nice try. Your glowing red eyes kind of ruin your cover. Just accept it. There's no escape." Gilrishin's mind short-circuited. Red eyes? Background character? I'm not even the main character. How did I end up in a discount ice guy where I die in the tutorial? Desperate, he muttered. What kind of cosmic prank is this? The man gave a shrug. Nothing personal. We'll make it quick. And just like that, he gave his cheerful farewell. Goodbye, third prince. Gilrishin squeezed his eyes shut. I can't die like this. I still have something important to wait. What was it again? As he braced for the incoming blade, he noticed nothing was happening. Why did the sword guy pause mid-murder? Then, with a ding, a glowing screen popped up. The game has begun. Player has selected. Gilrishin Elro de Vault Empire. Gilrishin nearly cried. I'm saved. I'm not a dead NPC. In a freaking player now. This was the world of godforsaken world, his all-time favorite game. Had lived and breathed it. Heck, he practically was the wiki. He smirked. Game on. Another ding. Starting rewards granted. Boom. Skill points, stat boosts, and a new quest. Escape crisis. Gilrishin grinned. Let's see them try to kill me now. Gilrishin realized he'd gotten stat points to boost his abilities and skill points for learning cool moves. As for the quest, obvious. Don't die. Everything was frozen, like someone had hit pause on the world. He could move, but just barely. Classic game logic, he thought. The system was giving him a short breather. Once time resumed, it was go time, and whether he lived or died depended on what he did now. Then came the big one, fate cards. These bad boys defined your class, gave you unique powers, gear, and even altered your storyline. Gilrishin was dealt 3 from a pool of 1,204 and had to pick just one. No pressure. The system cheerfully announced, shuffling cards. Gilrishin clenched his teeth. Picking the right one takes brains, but what shows up? That's pure RNG hell. And no reshuffle till level 10 unless Lady Luck pities me with a quest reward. The cards appeared before him, glowing and dramatic. Gilrishin inhaled. One pick, one shot. Once I choose, time resumes. No big deal, just his life on the line. Depending on his luck, or total lack of it, Gilrishin could be sliced like tofu the second time resumed. The thought gave him chills. Still, he pushed it aside. Focus. Cards first, panic later. Despite the danger, he couldn't help but grin. Was this the road to glory? A garbage dump? Or a cliff dive? In godforsaken world, there was a secret first shuffle rule. One card is always a close combat class, and the average rank is usually B. Alright, he told himself. Let's just go with something basic. A solid A rank tank. I'm not asking for a miracle. He flipped the first card. F rank. Okay, unlucky start. He flipped the second. F again. Gilrishin stared. Is the system trolling me? But then he remembered, if the first two are that bad, maybe, just maybe, the last one was an S-rank jackpot. Now they got his blood pumping. Hands trembling, Gilrishin flipped the final card and was nearly blinded by the blinding glow. Rank, EX class, Archmage. He froze. X, that's the highest rank in the game. An Archmage? That's the king of long-range nukes. But wait, how the hell did this show up now? Then it clicked. I'm not a custom player character. I'm an NPC. This body belonged to Gilrishin Vault, the so-called good-for-nothing prince. But unlike player builds, he came with a story, noble bloodlines. And the Vault family was famous for cranking out top-tier mages. Still, there was a catch. The Archmage card might have been god-tier, with bonus stats, exclusive gear, unique storylines, but Gilrishin's current priority was not getting sliced in half. And that was the problem. He could only use 3 unique skills per second, and while one of them, field domination, was defensive, it only worked against magic. Worse, all spells needed time to channel mana from the heart circle, which meant no instacast, no shield, no save. EX rank or not, Gilrishin was basically holding a missile launcher with a 5-second warm-up, while standing in front of a guy swinging a sword. Even knowing everything, Gilrishin was filled with regret. I know what the right choice is, but how do you say no to an EX rank Archmage? Any rookie would have grabbed it and lost their head, literally. If this were just a game, no big deal. Die, respawn, try again. But this was real. One beheading, and it was game over. No respawns, no second chances. He could feel the cold steel on his neck. This wasn't some fantasy cutscene. This was death in high definition. Whoever threw him into this world clearly had a twisted sense of humor. Not only did they stick him in the body of a loser NPC, they also made him a player right before execution, and then dangled an EX card like it was candy. Gilrishan gritted his teeth. No time to cry over nukes I can't use. He had one goal: survive. He hovered over the first card, the pathetic-looking F rank, Slave Gladiator. The system chimed. Confirm selection? Gilrishan sighed. Goodbye, Archmage. Hello, not dying. Gilrishan smiled like a man who just swapped a winning lottery ticket for a coupon. Never thought I'd throw away an EX rank for an F rank piece of junk, he said. This should be interesting. He picked the pathetic card, waved goodbye to the EX rank, and the system immediately popped up, F rank equipped. You've gained 3 unique Slave Gladiator skills. Gilrishan glared at the message like it had personally insulted him. Are you mocking me? In the original game, Whisper's character died here, bleeding out like a bad side quest. But now he was Gilrishan, and dying wasn't on the schedule. I'm gonna live, he told himself, then frowned. How do I actually use these skills? The game instantly resumed, and his opponent's attack came flying in like a tax bill. The commander, convinced Head just turned Gilrishan into royal roadkill, told his men, nice work. We're done here. Head back through the Lockman Mountain Gate. Chop chop. But before anyone could leave, a soldier yelled, Commander, the third prince is still alive. The commander blinked. Excuse me? Meanwhile, Gilrishan was on the ground, clutching his neck, eyes wide like someone who had just dodged a falling piano. The enemy soldiers looked baffled. Gilrishan, on the other hand, realized Head somehow activated one of his shiny new F-rank skills by pure instinct. Great for survival, horrible for his nerves. The system popped up, skill activated successfully. Cooldown, 24 hours. The Slave Gladiator had 3 skills: preference for masochism, preference for sadism, and preference for restraint. The last being why Gilrishan had picked the garbage F rank in the first place. If tied up or immobilized, it let him ignore one fatal blow. Only once a day, sure, but once was enough to keep his head attached. The F rank Slave Gladiator card was infamous among players with questionable tastes. At first glance, its skills looked useful, but Gilrishan knew the truth. Every single one came with a nasty drawback. No wonder it was trashed here. You almost never got a good chance to use them. The commander suddenly called out, Third Prince, how is your head still on your shoulders? Gilrishan wasn't in the mood to answer. If they attacked again, he was out of tricks. Time to vanish. But the commander wasn't done. I don't know what you just pulled, but it's not happening twice. Gilrishan snapped, shouting, Bamilo Damark, you impudent worm. The name drop made everyone's heads turn. The commander frowned. Have you lost your mind? And how do you even know my name? Gilrishan glared at the lot of them. Insolent fools. Do you not recognize your true master? He declared, I am the god of vengeance, Elam, now dwelling in this body. The crowd stared, confused, probably wondering if they'd just been cursed or invited to a very weird theater play. These men weren't just any thugs. They were priests of the Elam High Church's Vengeance Corps, fanatical followers of the god of vengeance. And, ironically, part-time assassins. The church was one of the game's 3 big factions, loyal to the Revolutionary Army. Naturally, they'd kidnapped the Empire's third prince, because why not? Gilrishan knew if he wanted to live, he had to go full third-rate theater actor. So, putting on his best divine voice, he declared, Fools, the one before you is Elam himself, descended into this body. Your god is here. Release me at once. The commander squinted. Wait, so Elam's just what's squatting the third prince's body now? Gilrishan's eyes blazed. How dare you point at Elam? You insolent mortal. Have you lost your mind? Somewhere in the back, one priest probably started wondering if their holy training covered dealing with a very angry god in royal pajamas. As Gilrishan laid it on thick, a tiny voice in his head wondered if he was overdoing it. Then he decided, nope, commit to the bit. If Elam were here, he'd go full drama mode. In this godforsaken world, there were 12 meddlesome deities who loved stirring up trouble. Divine interference was basically a daily weather forecast. When the game first launched, players thought Elam was just a badly named god, until they learned he was the god of vengeance, thriving on war, chaos, and petty grudges. Exactly the type to crash his followers' tea parties. The commander finally nodded. I understand. Elam. Then, hesitantly, could you give your foolish believers a sign of faith? Gilrishan's face darkened. How dare you? Last week you brought a golden statue to my altar, and you think I didn't notice it was gold-plated? The commander froze. eyes wide. "Do not take me for a fool," Gilrishin thundered. "Did you think I wouldn't spot such a pathetic prank? Do you wish for death?" At that moment, at least 3 priests started wondering if they still had time to switch religions. Gilrishin bellowed at the top of his lungs, demanding they release him at once. The commander instantly ordered his men to comply, and as they freed him, they bowed and apologized. Inside, Gilrishin smirked. Most of them had swallowed his act whole. And why wouldn't they? No one would believe the bumbling third-rate prince could pull this off. Still, the old man Bamilo's eyes were sharp with suspicion. Bamilo Demark, High Archpriest of the Elam High Church and leader of the Vengeance Priest Corps, was infamous in the Revolutionary Army as the mastermind behind the Third Prince assassination plot. Gilrishin figured the man was just watching for now. Bamilo bowed. "Forgive me, Elam, for not recognizing you." "That's all you have to say?" Gilrishin snapped, turning to the rest. "On your knees." Every man dropped instantly, voices ringing out in perfect unison as they begged the god of vengeance for forgiveness. Bamilo bowed deeper, saying it was an honor they didn't deserve to behold Elam, but then asked why Elam had descended in person instead of sending an oracle. Gilrishin immediately thought, sharp old man, still not buying it. And apparently, there was someone else just as suspicious, lurking in the corner. Catching the man in his peripheral vision, Gilrishin's curiosity itched, but he kept his focus. "Bamilo," he declared, "let me make this clear. The body of Prince Gilrishin will become Elam's personally chosen apostle. No one lays a finger on it." The commander's eyes went wide, and Bamilo's expression twisted like head just swallowed something foul. Gilrishin figured he couldn't blame him. They were about to lose the prize hostage they'd worked so hard to catch. Gilrishin declared that Prince Gilrishin himself would one day join the Revolutionary Army. Bamilo nodded, agreeing to spare the prince and return as per Elam's will. But Gilrishin knew the truth. Once they got back, they'd check with the high priest, then come looking for him again. Their eyes practically said, "We can kill you anytime we like." There had to be another traitor, someone pulling strings in the shadows. No imperial bloodline, useless or not, would be left to die unless both sides were in on it. And in Gilrishin's case, half the world seemed eager to see him dead. The empire felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Snapping back to the moment, Gilrishin told Bamilo, "This stays secret. The third prince won't return to the imperial palace. I'm going to Orax to prepare for apostleship." Bamilo frowned. "Why?" Gilrishin ignored the question and added, "On the way to Orax, you won't just protect me. You'll treat me with the utmost care." Orax, the largest city in the west and capital of the Revolutionary Army, was enemy territory to the empire, but Gilrishin knew he'd be safer there. In Orax, knowledge was power, and the more you knew, the more you could grab. Grinning darkly, he lamented losing the Archmage card, but there were still plenty of ways to cheat the system. "Well," he barked at the men, "why are we still standing here? Move." As his grin widened, one thought burned in his mind. If he wanted to turn this trash rank into an overpowered monster, he'd have to scam everything that wasn't nailed down. 4 days later, they were in a new spot, sitting around a campfire. The Revolutionary Army men were piling food in front of Gilrishin like he was some royal banquet judge, bickering over which dish he should try first. Gilrishin, looking like a man cornered by carbs, muttered that he was trying to lose weight. They ignored him completely, cheerfully insisting that Lord Elam had ordered him to be treated like an honored guest, and they couldn't face their lord if they failed. Gilrishin glanced at their eager, glowing faces and wondered if they were the Vengeance Priests or the Vengeance Boy Scouts. They definitely didn't have assassin eyes, more like your mom pack your lunch eyes. Still torn, he told them to stop, explaining that he wanted to eat but was trying to resist. Then he muttered that one bite wouldn't hurt. The men grinned and told him one bite wouldn't make him fat, then proceeded to hand him enough food to feed a small kingdom. One soldier suddenly asked what Gilrishin even had to lose, claiming his body was already perfect and telling him to eat his heart out. Gilrishin replied that now they were just flat out lying, and in his head thought, losing weight is one thing, but this is pure psychological warfare. Before they could shove more food at him, Bamilo appeared, demanding why no one was on watch. Gilrishin was relieved. Finally, someone to end the buffet ambush. Bamilo, clearly annoyed, reminded them they were in imperial territory and ordered them to move. Then, turning to Gilrishin, Bamilo explained the men were just devoted and meant no harm. Gilrishin assured him he wasn't offended. Bamilo then offered him food, saying foul meat was the best. Gilrishin deadpanned that Bamilo was the worst. Bamillo smirked and said he was joking. This meal was on him. Bamillo remarked he never thought Gilrishin would lose so much waste in just 4 days. Gilrishin agreed. He didn't think it was possible either. Bamillo, recalling all the people Head met as a church-trained assassin, said Head never seen anyone as determined. He started to say at first, but Gilrishin cut in, asking if Bamillo had been wondering how to smuggle such a giant lump of lard out of the Empire. Privately, Gilrishin admitted even he thought his body was a disaster. The past few days, just walking felt like climbing a mountain in lead boots. Then the system flashed his stats, single-digit stamina. An average NPC had 40 to 60. He had 9. In other words, his body wasn't a warrior's. It was basically a well-dressed corpse. Gilrishin declared he had to raise his stamina no matter what, and maybe drop a few pounds while at it. Bamillo frowned, saying they'd only just started and Gilrishin was already this tired. One soldier muttered this was bad. At this rate, they'd all be in danger. But they couldn't abandon him. Lord Elam's orders. So he wondered if they should use a potion. Gilrishin refused. The Vengeance Priest Corps might need those for actual battles, and being a burden already made him feel like garbage. Then in peak drama mode, he slammed his head into the ground, stood up with blood dripping down his face, and declared he needed no potions, just to keep moving. The system instantly chimed in. Masochism skill preference activated. 30 seconds only. While active, taking non-lethal hits boosted his mental and physical recovery. Cool down, 15 minutes. Basically, pain made him stronger, just not for long. Gilrishin in that moment thought that low stats were great, easy to raise without wasting points. With that, he decided he would rather bash his head and then be dead weight. So he did. In that moment, the men watched in shock as the rogue prince repeatedly head-butted the ground like it owed him money. Moments later, the system popped up, congratulating him on gaining stamina from harsh training. Back to the present, Gilrishin thought this was only the warm-up. Bamillo in that moment called him Prince and said they'd reach the teleport gate tomorrow to return to Orax. However, Bamillo added they had originally come to kill him, since no one wanted him joining Lord Elam. Gilrishin in that moment told him to just say it. Bamillo admitted they needed a corpse for proof, but now, inconveniently, it was still breathing. Bamillo said that since Gilrishin had not returned either, the insider would think the deal had gone wrong, and the gate was probably useless now. He added they were the elite Vengeance Priest Corps, good at smashing through enemies, but not so good when attacked from both the front and the rear. Gilrishin in that moment said he understood, but they had to hurry anyway. Bamillo then asked how Gilrishin already knew they had an insider, and if he knew who it was. Gilrishin in that moment said it was the Prime Minister, Viscount Gyric Moss, and asked if he was right. Bamillo asked why he thought that, and Gilrishin was surprised that Bamillo did not already know the answer. Gilrishin in that moment thought Bamillo was not baiting him, only curious. He decided he had to prove himself if he wanted to use the Vengeance Priest Corps. Thinking carefully, he told Bamillo that the Prime Minister was born in the Empire but of Khan tribe blood, and that tribe was close to the Revolutionary Army. He asked if it was true the Prime Minister's daughter had recently married, saying a noble near the border would either hate the Revolutionary Army or work with them. Smiling, Gilrishin added that the marriage was a line of contact with a Revolutionary Guard tied to the Elam High Church, perhaps even a priest. Gilrishin in that moment thought this was fun and that he should have studied like this before, while Bamillo was surprised at how clearly Gilrishin had explained it. Bamillo said it was surprising to see such insight, adding that Gilrishin was very different from how people viewed him. Gilrishin in that moment thought Bamillo now looked at him like he was a completely new person, which was natural since Bamillo had only seen his outer shell. Either way, their retreat path was cut off, and Gilrishin, who should have died, was still alive. In the story, the third prince should have died 4 days ago, so the game had now changed. Prime Minister Gyric would use his strongest cards, the closest army near Kariton and the Lockman Mountain Range, the Special Forces Knights, led by Marquis Elrenroyd. As Gilrishin thought about this, Bamillo said they needed to ditch their pursuers and reach the gate, telling Gilrishin to hang on tight. Bamillo then said that if they stalled and got surrounded, they really would. Though before he could finish, Gilrishin cut in, saying they could not do that because there was no way they would break through like that. Bamillo asked what they should do, while Gilrishin in his mind thought they needed a brand new path, one not even in the game, and wondered what that would be. Bamillo started saying he had been ordered by Lord Elam to safely escort Gilrishin, but Gilrishin interrupted again, telling him to wait here for a while. Bamillo, now baffled, asked why. That was when the mysterious person Gilrishan had been curious about since the beginning spoke up, asking if Gilrishan planned to wait for the bear and the Oriole chasing them. He asked again if Gilrishan wanted to wait for his bodyguards, while Gilrishan in that moment wondered who this man was and why he knew so much about the situation. The mysterious man in that moment told Gilrishan to keep his mouth shut since he had spoken the truth, adding that if Gilrishan would not open it, he would help him do so. Gilrishan thought that since the man spoke first, he should try to figure him out. The man ordered him to answer, saying his sword was getting impatient. Gilrishan laughed, asked who he thought he was, and said he had no reason to answer someone he did not even know. He added that Archpriest Bamillo would not just watch after such threat. The man grew furious, while Gilrishan noted he was unexpectedly simple. Standing, Gilrishan said two things. First, he had no intention of returning to the palace. Otherwise, he would have stalled for time. So why else join the Vengeance Priest Corps? Second, the man was right about waiting for the bear and the Oriole, but he would not say why, and he hated bastards like him anyway. The man at that time, on hearing that, was pissed off and grabbed Gilrishan by the collar, telling him to know his place and that he was only alive because they had kept him safe. Gilrishan was not scared at all and was about to provoke him further when he suddenly stopped, surprised by the faint smell of flowers. In that moment, Bamillo stepped between them and said that was enough, and both immediately stopped, intimidated by him. Bamillo then changed the subject and told Gilrishan that the man was Urgel, not from the church but a comrade of the revolution. Gilrishan thought that was expected and that Urgel was a mercenary. In God-forsaken world, the player character was not tied to any one group, meaning he could roam freely like a mercenary. Gilrishan then looked at Urgel, thinking he had never heard the name before and wondering if this man might be from the real world like him. Urgel in that moment told Gilrishan to explain why he wanted to wait for the bear and the Oriole, his shadows, the 6th rank knight Carl Cillian and 7th rank Witch Turban Sway. He pressed for an answer, then told Bamillo they should turn him into a corpse immediately. Gilrishan cut in, saying the commander of the Special Forces Knights was Marquis Elrenroyd, and asked if they had heard the name. Bamillo said of course, one of the Empire's 3 sword masters, then asked why Gilrishan mentioned him. Gilrishan asked if Bamillo could beat him. When neither spoke, he told them to stop staring and use their mouths. As the two stayed quiet, Gilrishan, now serious, said that if they kept going like this, they would all die to Elrenroyd, and if they wanted to die, they could do it alone because he was not planning on joining. Marquis Elrenroyd was a 9-star swordsman, an NPC in the early 90s by player standards, basically a walking death sentence. Gilrishan added that facing him was fine if their goal was to vanish without leaving even a corpse. Urgel, now worried, asked if the Empire's dagger was coming for them, saying that if Gilrishan was right, they were all dead. Gilrishan, surprised he did not argue, thought to himself that maybe this Urgel bastard was not completely stupid after all. Bamillo asked Gilrishan what the plan was now, pointing out that if Elrenroyd and his knights were blocking the gate, even the bear and the Oriole could not help. Gilrishan eyed Urgel, thinking he probably knew how this would play out. Then he said there was a way to get through to Orax if they followed his lead. But first, he needed 2 promises. 1, keep what he was about to say a secret. Bamillo asked why, but Gilrishan told them to swear on the name of Elam. After a pause, Bamillo agreed, swearing to take it to his grave. Gilrishan then said the second thing was a favor Bamillo would need to do once they entered Orax. Bamillo, now curious, asked what it was. Gilrishan said he needed Bamillo to find him one thing in Orax. Bamillo asked what, and Gilrishan, grinning, said it was just a pair of glasses, then immediately demanded another oath on Elam's name. After that, Gilrishan casually dropped the bomb. The bear, aka Carl Cillian, aka the Knight of Dawn, was actually Karlsroyd. Bamillo's jaw dropped. Was he Elrenroyd's secret kid? Gilrishan confirmed it, adding that almost nobody knew, not even Carl's himself. While talking, Gilrishan studied Urgel and thought, yep, he already knows. If Urgel was a real person like him, he must have noticed the most shocking fact of all. The 3rd prince, supposedly dead, was very much alive. Gilrishan wondered just how much Urgel actually knew about the game. Elsewhere, Carl's and a fiery red-haired which were still yelling his name like lost parents in a supermarket. Carl stopped, gripped his sword, and threatened the kidnappers to release the 3rd prince while they still had a chance. The kidnappers, meanwhile, were silently thinking, yeah, we did kidnap him, but now he's tagging along by choice. Meanwhile, Gilrishan was sprinting like his life depended on it, thinking he had left clues for Carl's to follow. just not this quickly. If Turvin got involved, the priest would stop holding back and go full deathmatch mode. He had to hurry before things got bloody. Somewhere else, Turvin, the red-haired witch and Gilrishan's master, was done being polite. She ordered the trembling men to spill where her disciple, the third prince, was. They tried to explain, but she shut them down. Furious, they dared kidnap him and then tell her to wait. She was ready to barbecue them first and look for Gilrishan later. Just as they were about to panic into tears, Gilrishan showed up and yelled for her to hold on. Carls and Turvin froze, staring at the stranger who looked like Gilrishan but with an entirely different build. They both asked, "Who the hell are you?" Gilrishan just grinned and said, "It is me, the one and only." Instead of celebrating, Carls went full rage mode, yelling at the kidnappers, calling them bastards, and demanding to know what they had done to shrink the third prince to half his size. The men glanced at each other, silently swearing they had done nothing. Gilrishan jumped in, telling Carls and his master to let him explain. "I was kidnapped." Briefly, he said, "But I am not kidnapped anymore." That did not clear things up. Carls still looked lost, while Turvin's fury hit maximum overdrive. She cursed him out, ranting about how she had gone through hell to find him, only for him to spout this nonsense. Then she promised to kill him and the kidnappers together. Gilrishan, sighing internally, thought, "Yeah, I know a master will not respect her disciple, but this is ridiculous." Still fuming, Turvin demanded if Gilrishan had really planned to ignore her and asked if this was what she had taught him. Gilrishan, meanwhile, was debating whether his master was truly a witch or just a professional thug. Maybe all the swearing came with the job, because if she were a saint, her vocabulary would be much cleaner. Turvin Sway, nicknamed the Crimson Shadow, was the pride of the Vault Magic Empire, trained in the Five-Colored Tower. Rumors claimed she was a 200-year-old hag who bathed in virgin blood to stay young. Reality check. She was actually 19. The whole ancient witch thing was just a family brand. Same name, same magic, same face, passed down like a cursed heirloom. Right then, Carl stepped in, addressed her politely as Lady Sway, and suggested she calm down since they were not in any danger. Turvin's heart instantly melted at his good looks, and she agreed without a fight. Watching this, Gilrishan thought, yep, Turvin witches are helpless against handsome men. Gilrishan suddenly changed the subject. "I'm going to Orax," he declared. Turvin blinked. "Ah, so you finally lost your mind." Carls nearly exploded. "That's enemy territory, the stronghold of the Revolutionary Army. Have you lost your—" Yes, I know," Gilrishan cut in. "I'm not walking the same scoundrel's path anymore. This is the only way I survive. My fate. My choice. So don't stop me. Lord's orders." Then he turned to Turvin. "Forgive your useless disciple. You probably think I've been dodging your lessons all this time, but I haven't given up on magic. It just wasn't time yet. One day, it'll shine with all 5 colors." Turvin just stared at him like he had promised to turn into a rainbow unicorn. Turvin was taken aback when she realized that Gilrishan had never truly abandoned magic. And as she looked at him, she couldn't help but wonder if his gaze had always held such quiet determination, since before he could barely look anyone in the eyes. The fact that he mentioned gaining the multicolored light through her guidance made her recall an old saying from the multicolored tower, the place where she had studied magic. It was said that true Grat magic glowed with a dazzling spectrum of light, a phrase so ancient that few magicians in the present age even remembered it. She found herself curious as to how Gilrishan had come to know of such words. A faint smile appeared on her face as she thought about how wrong she had been about him, believing he had no love or gift for magic, and that his cold attitude toward it was real, when in truth he had been hiding his passion all along. He had managed to play the fool within the palace flawlessly, concealing his real nature even from her. Turvin couldn't help but feel responsible, wondering how she, as his teacher, had failed to notice this for 5 long years. Gilrishan's quiet confession about wanting her and Carl's by his side made sense now, and she found herself agreeing without hesitation, a sense of pride and regret mingling within her as she watched him. Gilrishan was caught off guard when his master agreed without any hesitation, but before he could think much about it, Turvin smoothly shifted the topic and remarked that as the fallen master of the once reckless third prince, now that her student had finally found clarity, it was only right for her, as a teacher, to place her faith in him. She even joked lightly to herself that perhaps one day, the prince might rise high enough to make her the master of the 5-colored tower. As those thoughts passed through her mind, she couldn't help but analyze the situation, realizing that while Gilrishan now seemed certain of his path, The real challenge would be Sir Karl's. From what she had learned while following Gilrishin's trail, Karl's was the type of man who clung to rules above all else, one who valued order so deeply that he refused any form of compromise. Turvin was certain Karl's would defy any order from Gilrishin, even dragging him back to the palace if needed. Yet to her shock, Karl's knelt before the prince, tears in his eyes, and swore unwavering loyalty. Both teacher and student stood speechless as a bright notification appeared, announcing that Turvin and Karl's had officially joined Gilrishin's party. Elsewhere, Elrin Roit raged as his men reported only faint traces of the fugitives. He cursed Gilrishin as a worthless burden and blamed him for everything. To protect his son Karl's from slavery, Elrin had hidden his origins and secured him a future under the Cillian name, only for fate to tie him to that reckless prince. Now, with Gilrishin missing and scandal growing, Elrin's fury burned hotter, convinced the prince had destroyed his brilliant son's future. Elrin muttered bitterly that at least Karl's had survived the kidnapping, though as long as his son stayed tied to that troublesome prince, disaster was inevitable. Still, he saw an opportunity in the chaos. If the third prince were quietly removed, Karl's could claim a rightful place in the prestigious Third Knights division. Turning to his subordinate, Elrin asked about reports that Karl's Cillian and Lady Turvin Sway were also pursuing the prince. The man replied that though Lady Turvin was a 7th rank witch, her poison flame magic made her poor at tracking, so it was unlikely they had found him. Elrin's anger shifted to a cold smile. Fortune, he thought, was finally on his side. He ordered his men to forget about rescuing anyone and instead intercept and annihilate the kidnappers completely. No negotiations, no mercy. His subordinate stiffened and obeyed, fully grasping that failure meant death. After issuing his final orders, Elrin commanded his men to move out, satisfied that the special forces would now focus solely on annihilating the kidnappers, even if it meant turning the land into a blood-soaked field. Meanwhile, Gilrishin was lost in thought when Karl suddenly appeared behind him, making him flinch. Karl eyed the sword in his hand and asked what he was thinking. Gilrishin only said he needed it, offering no explanation. Karl remarked that he looked thinner, his features sharper than before. Gilrishin scoffed inwardly. Anyone would after days of running through mountains while being hunted. Still, he was alive, and that was enough. Karl's, hearing this, felt a weight lift yet also a deep ache inside. After everything, Gilrishin had survived, but the fear of losing him had been unbearable. Remembering how far he had chased after him, Karl's lowered his head, his thoughts heavy, unsure what he would have done if things had ended differently. Gilrishin was caught off guard by the look on Karl's face, the mix of worry and relief surprising him more than he expected. He recalled that in the original story, Gilrishin and Karl's had grown up together as distant relatives, almost like brothers, so it was natural for Karl's to care so deeply. Though he was no longer the same Gilrishin from that tale, he couldn't help feeling a quiet warmth seeing Karl's alive and close again. Karl's Roit, the charging leader, the Knight of Dawn, a powerful tank with unmatched loyalty, was someone worth keeping by his side. If raised well, Karl's could become one of the strongest allies in the endgame, which was exactly why Gilrishin had always made sure to keep him close. Seeing him now felt strangely nostalgic, like meeting an old friend from a lifelong past. As these thoughts ran through his head, Turvin's calm voice broke his focus, asking if he had rested well. Gilrishin glanced at her, thinking that unlike Karl's, she had always been harder to get close to, more distant and guarded. Perhaps that was why, even now, his feelings toward her lingered in a quiet, complicated way. Karl's looked at Turvin kindly and asked if she had slept well, making her blush and fluster as she admitted she had, secretly distracted by his handsomeness. Still blushing, she said she would wash her face for a moment, while Gilrishin watched her, feeling a strange mix of warmth and unease, as if seeing someone he owed a debt to. Karl's then commented that Gilrishin seemed slimmer, but still full of energy, which felt comforting, almost like returning to old times. Gilrishin was puzzled at first, and Karl's clarified that he meant their days at the Boys' Palace, a school for children of high-ranking nobles. Hearing that, Gilrishin reflected that the palace had been like a school for elite children, and Karl's reminded him that back then he'd been clever, admired by court ladies, and even valued by the king. Gilrishin was surprised to learn that the third prince had once been ordinary, a detail never mentioned in the game or novel. Karl's added that things would have been very different for Gilrishin if the Vault Empire had not placed such importance on magic as a basic skill for everyone, hinting at how much their world shaped his fate. Gilrishan thought it made sense. Being the third prince of a magic empire without any talent meant expectations had always weighed heavily on him. The love he had received as a child might have made the people around him bitter when he failed, but that wasn't really his past anymore. He told himself and Carls not to dwell on regrets, that what mattered now was the present, and that no one remembered the third prince of the boys' palace anymore except for Carls. Hearing this, Carls felt a pang of pity for all Gilrishan had endured, but also a small relief that he hadn't given up. Gilrishan felt a surge of confidence, certain he could face the god-forsaken world even as a failed prince and roughneck, refusing to let circumstances define him. Magic talent wasn't necessary. Even if he had been an X-rank archmage now reduced to an F-rank slave gladiator, he knew there would always be another chance ahead, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. Gilrishan, filled with resolve, told Carls to remember one thing. He would return to the Empire with the right to survive, and when he did, no one would dare look down on him, his friend, his brother, or the ruler he was meant to be. He urged Carls to keep his head held high, and Carls nodded, claiming he had always done so. Gilrishan teased him for being dim-witted, and Carls quickly said he was joking, prompting Gilrishan to question him, which made Carls protest with mock annoyance. Shifting gears, Gilrishan suggested they focus on future plans now that the three of them were together. He reminded Carls why returning to the palace was impossible, and Carls noted it was because the palace was crawling with traitors. Gilrishan agreed, then asked if they knew Marquis Elrenroit, the man responsible for defending the northern part of the capital, signaling the next challenge ahead. Carls recognized the name and thought of Elren as his father's ally and one of the Empire's three Blade Masters, but a chill ran through him at the idea that Elrenroit might be one of the traitors. Gilrishan, however, was quick to correct that worry, describing Marquis Roit as an honorable warrior who lived by code and would not betray his post. The real problem was far simpler and far worse. Roit was standing guard at the gate and would move to crush any assassins and drag Gilrishan back to the palace. The three of them faced a brutal choice, and Carls felt the panic rise as he realized their usual way of winning hearts would fail here. If they tried to charm or reason with the Marquis, the Vengeance Priest Corps would be cut down, and both Carls and Gilrishan would be hauled straight to the throne with no say in the matter. Gilrishan smiled at Carls' panic, reassuring him that he wasn't disappointed and there was no need to worry. Carls brightened at that, hoping Gilrishan had another plan, and Gilrishan confirmed he did. The two leaned in, curious, only for Gilrishan to lift his sword and declare that his method was simple. He would defeat Marquis Roit and get past him, and there was no other way. At first, Carls and Turvin exchanged blank looks, then panic quickly set in. Carls, still flustered, questioned if Gilrishan had lost his mind, hoping at least one of them stayed sane, while Turvin, equally shocked, assumed he wasn't thinking straight and asked to be sent home. Carls kept worrying, and Gilrishan, watching them, thought they were far too impatient. Annoyed, he scolded them silently, insisting that they needed to listen before jumping to conclusions, because what he had in mind to face Marquis Roit was not something they could ignore. Carls, frustrated, asked Gilrishan who was really being unreasonable and pressed him on how they could possibly win against the commander. Turvin, kneeling, admitted it was good that Gilrishan showed interest in magic, but even she couldn't fully grasp the scale of what he was suggesting. Watching their worried expressions, Gilrishan realized it made sense. They were completely underestimating him. In the god-forsaken world, victory didn't depend on leveling stats alone, and opponents like this commander were immune to fate card boosts. With perfect strategy, traps, and mental tactics, even a 6-star could defeat a 9-star, but Gilrishan reminded himself that he wasn't a 6-star yet. He was effectively level 0. Seeing their despair, Turvin urged Carls to at least listen to Gilrishan's plan, and he calmly laid out. He would request a noble duel with Marquis Roit and send the Marquis sword flying. That was the entire plan, simple and deadly, no other options needed. Carls muttered to himself, convinced that what Gilrishan was proposing was impossible. A noble duel or conditional battle was a formal Vault Empire tradition, a one-on-one fight governed by aristocratic rules where all conditions had to be agreed upon by both fighters and the observer, including what counted as victory. Gilrishan, however, saw a way to make it work by carefully setting the rules and suggested Carls act as the observer. Carls immediately questioned what kind of rules Gilrishan had in mind, warning that if the conditions were dangerous or unreasonable, neither he nor Marquis Roit would accept them. Gilrishan calmly outlined 3 rules. First, it would be pure swordsmanship only. Second, dropping your sword meant immediate loss. Third, no shields could be used. Hearing these, Carls grew furious, realizing that none of the rules favored Gilrishin and that the plan was as reckless as it sounded. In that moment, Carl spoke up and explained to Gilrishin that the proposed rules were far less beneficial than they appeared, especially from Gilrishin's perspective, and he went on to clarify that although the first condition of relying solely on pure swordsmanship might initially seem advantageous for someone without mana, it was in fact the opposite, as Commander Roy possessed exceptional mastery in swordsmanship, making the situation even more dangerous for Gilrishin. He then pointed out the second condition, emphasizing that the moment a participant let go of their sword, the duel would be lost, and he reasoned that the weaker individual naturally had a higher likelihood of losing their grip, which made the condition inherently unfair. Furthermore, Carls expressed concern over the decision to exclude shields, explaining that this would only place Gilrishin in greater danger, something he found completely unacceptable. With a worried expression, Carls continued to stress that a duel was not something to be taken lightly, and that no responsibility would be assumed if anything were to happen during the fight, regardless of Gilrishin's status as a prince. Because of these reasons, Carls concluded that he could not stand by as an observer under such conditions. Yet despite all of this, Gilrishin remained calm and reassured him that his life would not be in danger, which only led Carls to question how such certainty was even possible. In that moment, Gilrishin explained things to Carls through a hypothetical scenario. He described that if Carls had trained in swordsmanship for 50 years and reached the level of a sword master, and then one day a rookie were to challenge him, the situation would already be strange, but it would become even more so if that challenger was a prince while the opponent was a marquis, and with that, he led Carls to consider how he would react. Hearing this, Carls found the idea absurd and amusing. He reasoned that he would not go all out against a rookie. He also considered that enduring a prince would only bring unnecessary trouble. Because of that, he would likely hold back and simply knock the sword out of the opponent's hand. Gilrishin, upon hearing this, acknowledged that this was exactly the point. He had set the condition of no armor for that very reason. It would force Marquis Roy to act with caution. In short, there was no real chance that Roy would kill him, even if he might want to. At that moment, Gilrishin also thought to himself that Carls would be present as a witness. In front of his own son, Roy would not dare harm the third prince. Meanwhile, Carls grew curious about the reason behind the commander's hostility. Gilrishin, hearing that, realized he needed to come up with an explanation. He already knew the truth. Carl's father intended to kill him for the future. However, he could not say that out loud. In that moment, Gilrishin let out a nervous laugh and briefly explained that there was simply some bad blood between him and the Marquis. Carls, hearing that, questioned what exactly he meant. Gilrishin avoided going into detail and only stated that it was complicated. As their conversation continued, Turvin spoke up. She mentioned that she had been wondering about something since earlier, as she had not seen the priest squad that day. Gilrishin, hearing her question, explained that he had asked them for a favor. At the same time, in a different location, several goblins could be seen tied to trees. The followers of Elam were gathered there. They were talking among themselves and claiming that the one they had captured would please Gilrishin more. They began competing with one another. As the argument over which goblin was better continued, Bamillo suddenly appeared. He reminded them that true faith should remain steady and sincere. At that moment, he was holding a monster that appeared even stronger than the ones the others had captured. At that moment, the men, upon seeing the monster Bamillo had captured, protested and accused him of cheating, insisting that he release it. Bamillo dismissed their words as nonsense and refused, stating that he would not let it go after the effort he had put into capturing it. One of the men then raised another concern. He asked what should be done with the people who had been captured by the goblins. Hearing this, Bamillo explained that he had already sent those people back to their village. He had also instructed them that it was the will of God Elam, and that they should offer their gratitude. After saying this, he shifted the topic. He told his men that they had already gathered enough monsters and that the preparations were complete. He then ordered them to go and bring the third prince, Gilrishin. At that moment, the men began arguing among themselves. Each of them wanted to be the one to fetch him. Bamillo grew annoyed at their behavior. He told them to calm down and composed himself. He acknowledged that Gilrishin might become a future apostle. However, he also reminded them that until the archbishop confirmed it, nothing was certain. For now, Gilrishin was still a prince of an enemy nation. Bamillo then added that until everything was certain, they needed to be careful not to grow too attached. After saying this, he called out to Urgel. He instructed him to go and fetch Gilrishin. Urgel agreed without hesitation. As he did so, he thought to himself that this was the perfect opportunity. He needed to clearly understand what Gilrishin was planning. Depending on what he discovered, he intended to deal with him accordingly. Meanwhile, back with Gilrishin and the others, Gilrishin stood up and stated that things should be wrapping up soon. He suggested that they continue talking while moving. Turvin, hearing that, questioned what he meant by wrapping up. Gilrishin explained that he had asked the priest order to clear out a nearby goblin village. By now, they should have finished. As he said this, he thought to himself that in gaming terms, it was like carrying a newbie. Even so, he concluded that the final blow should be delivered by him. Moments later, as they continued walking, Gilrishin brought up what he considered his next move, referring to it as his trump card. He explained that he knew the Marquis' true weakness. Carls, hearing this, responded that he was already aware of a weakness as well, pointing out the Marquis' relatively poor synergy between magic and swordsmanship. Turvin added that she had also heard something similar. She mentioned that there were claims about the Marquis having inefficient magic output. Gilrishin, however, clarified that those were only considered weaknesses when compared to other swordmasters. He then revealed the actual issue. The Marquis currently had a serious problem with his right shoulder. It was badly paralyzed. Upon hearing this, both of them were visibly surprised. In the game, Marquis Roit was known to appear with a paralyzed right shoulder for unknown reasons. Turvin, still unsure, asked if this information was true, as it was the first time she had heard of it. Gilrishin confirmed that it was indeed true. Carls then questioned where he had obtained such information. Hearing that, Gilrishin thought to himself that he would have to lie for the time being. At that moment, Gilrishin explained that he had come across this information after overhearing a conversation between His Majesty, the Emperor, and the captain of the Imperial Knights. Turvin, hearing that, concluded that it must be true if it had come from such important figures. Carls then reasoned that if this was accurate, the captain would not be able to use vanguard swordsmanship, as that technique required the use of both hands. Gilrishin agreed with this assessment. Vanguard swordsmanship was an S-class skill. It was a secret technique of the Roit family, one of the most prestigious swordsmanship houses in the Empire. The style focused on powerful cleaving attacks performed with a two-handed sword. It was considered a top-tier technique and was a very skill that had elevated Elrin Roit to the level of a 9-star swordsman. It also worked in perfect synergy with his Howlblade. Turvin then pointed out that if Elrin Roit could not use this skill, it meant that they finally had a way to win. However, Carls quickly countered that a swordmaster was still a swordmaster. He explained that even with one hand, the captain could still wield swordsmanship at a 7-star level. Because of that, he concluded that even under such limitations, Elrin Roit would remain far beyond the level of His Highness. At that moment, Gilrishin, upon hearing Carl's words, began to question where his loyalties truly lay and wondered if he was simply an overly devoted loyalist. Even so, he acknowledged that Carls was not wrong. He admitted that what had been said was true. However, he then added that he also knew which sword technique the Marquis would resort to when limited to using only one hand. Hearing this, both Carls and Turvin were visibly surprised that Gilrishin possessed such detailed knowledge. Gilrishin, thinking to himself, recalled how in the Sinverse world, sword techniques carried strong affinities, and because of that, even a seemingly trivial skill could become many times more powerful, depending on the matchup. After considering this, he explained that if the condition was simply to make the Marquis drop his sword, then there was at least a slight chance of success. However, just as he was saying this, Urgel suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He immediately stated that such a plan would not be enough to force Marquis Roit to drop his sword. Gilrishin, seeing Urgel, was taken aback. He could not help but wonder when exactly Urgel had arrived and how long he had been listening to their conversation. Urgel then stepped forward and expressed his doubt, stating that Gilrishin likely did not have the strength to endure even a single strike from the Marquis, and he questioned whether that assessment was incorrect. Gilrishin responded with a faint smile. He admitted that it would indeed be difficult for him in his current state. That was precisely why he had come here, as he intended to obtain the Elixir of Strength, a consumable capable of temporarily boosting one's power to a significant degree. Hearing this, Urgel began to piece things together. He realized that Gilrishin was planning to challenge the king of the Lockman Mountains. At the same time, he also considered that even if Gilrishin managed to gain the support of the Vengeance Priest Corps, the king was still a raid-level monster, and defeating it would not be easy. Gilrishin then continued explaining that he was already aware that their current strength was insufficient. That was the reason they were lingering in the area. They were waiting for additional help to arrive. In the next moment, the scene shifted. Gilrishan stood before a goblin that was still alive. The creature warned him to stay back, expressing its hatred toward humans. Seeing this, Gilrishan thought to himself that unlike in the game, this was a living being. He did not want to go through with it. However, he had no choice. It was necessary for his survival in this world. Sensing the change in his expression, the goblin grew fearful. It tried to persuade him, claiming that he was a good human and that it liked humans, even offering him a gift in an attempt to save itself. Despite this, Gilrishan ended its life. Immediately after, the system interface appeared. It notified him that he had leveled up, gained 1 skill point, and could now open his skill tree to unlock a new ability. Seeing this, Gilrishan calculated that along with the 2 points he had received earlier, he now had a total of 3. Without hesitation, he used all 3 points. As a result, he learned the martial arts of the Wanderer. The system informed him that fierce combat techniques were being engraved into his body. It also granted him a 1% increase to both his strength and endurance stats. Gilrishan, in that moment, thought to himself that he needed to reach level 9 in order to obtain the sword techniques required to face the Marquis. At present, he was only level 1. He realized that he still had a long way to go. As that thought settled, he began eliminating all the monsters that had been captured by the Vengeance Priest Corps. With each kill, he continued leveling up repeatedly. At the same time, he accumulated 4 additional skill points. His ability to respond to emergency situations also improved, and he gained a 1% increase to his intelligence stat. Carls, upon observing him, asked if he was feeling any different. Turvin also questioned him, wondering if he had secretly taken some powerful elixirs while she was not paying attention. Meanwhile, Gilrishan reflected on the skills he had just acquired. He could clearly feel his body becoming stronger. He casually responded that it was something along those lines and mentioned that the Priest Corps had prepared some useful items for him. Turvin, hearing that, immediately asked where they were. She stated that she intended to take some as well. However, Gilrishan replied that he had already used all of them. Hearing this, Turvin became furious. She lashed out, accusing him of not considering his own master and taking everything for himself. She called him ungrateful and greedy. Gilrishan, in response, grew irritated. He thought to himself that Turvin was only 19 and should not act so overbearing toward him. At that point, Bamillo stepped in and asked what else they should do for him. Gilrishan instructed him to gather any remaining goblins in the area and bring only a manageable number for them to handle on their own. As he said this, he reflected that simply landing the final blow was no longer enough. He needed to hunt them personally. He also needed proper practice with the sword. Just then, Carl suddenly raised his voice and warned that monsters were approaching. Gilrishan looked ahead. Normally, 3 or 4 would have been sufficient for them to handle, but the number now advancing toward them was far greater than expected, causing him to grow uneasy. He glanced back at Turvin, who was still sulking. Carls urged him to stay focused as the monsters closed in. In the next instant, one of the goblins leapt forward and declared its intent to kill him along with all the humans. At that moment, as Gilrishan clashed with the monster, he found himself questioning how a creature as small as a goblin could possess such strength. Even so, he realized that something had changed. He was unsure if it was due to the slave fighter card, but wielding a sword no longer felt awkward as it once had. Not only that, he could clearly perceive the suggested strike points appearing at the right moments, just like in the game. After finishing off the monster in front of him, he thought to himself that the experience was better than he had expected. With that realization, he began to look forward to facing the rest of the monsters approaching him. Moments later, Gilrishan activated the skill preference for masochism. This ability boosted both his mental and physical regeneration for the next 30 seconds. He had no intention of stopping. Whenever he felt exhausted, he simply activated the skill again and continued fighting. As time passed, Carls and the rest of the men began to show clear signs of fatigue. They were visibly worn out. Carls eventually pointed this out, noting that both he and the Priest Corps had reached their limits. Hearing this, Gilrishan decided to stop for the day. He told them they could head back and rest. He also mentioned that they would drink together afterward. Upon hearing that, everyone's mood immediately lifted, and they grew excited at the thought. Moments later, they were sitting by the campfire, and while the Priest Corps were still talking among themselves and sharing stories about what they had encountered, 2 mysterious individuals were observing Gilrishan and the rest from a distance. And at that moment, one of them asked his vice captain what they were going to do about the situation. The vice captain, however, while observing Gilrishan, found himself confused as he could not understand what was going on, as the third prince, who used to be known for his unimpressive appearance, now looked completely different from before. As the vice captain and his men continued watching from afar, One of the men asked again what they were going to do and whether they should kill them all, but the vice captain, still unsure of his decision, told him to wait for a bit as he was still thinking. At that moment, he reflected on how over the past few days, Gilrishin and those with him had not even tried to erase their traces, and now they had even started a fire without using any camouflage spell, which made him question what they were even thinking. He then observed that only a few of the priest corps were drinking, including the third prince himself, which made the situation feel unnatural. And because of that, he suspected that it might be a trap set for him and his men. At the same time, he reminded himself that their orders were to eliminate the kidnappers. Yet the third prince was not acting like he was being kidnapped at all, and to make matters more confusing, both Carl Cillian and Turvin Sway were present with him, which only deepened his uncertainty. The vice captain then considered that the situation did not even feel like a trap. As he continued thinking about what to do, one of the men once again asked him how they should handle the situation, and in response, the vice captain instructed his men to remain where they were, as he needed to understand what was happening first. Right after making that decision, he stepped forward toward Gilrishin and the others, and soon after, he revealed himself to them. When Gilrishin and the rest saw that it was the vice captain of the Special Knights forces, they were visibly surprised by his sudden appearance. Gilrishin recognized him and addressed him as Felit, and upon hearing his voice, Felit acknowledged that he was relieved to see that the third prince was safe. As Gilrishin was about to respond, Felit cut him off and shifted his attention to Carl's, questioning what he was doing there and implying that an explanation was owed. He then raised a more serious suspicion, questioning whether Carl's had betrayed the Empire alongside the third prince and Turvin Sway. As he considered this possibility, Felit reflected that although the third prince had always been known as a troublemaker, his current actions would be far too disrespectful for a member of the imperial family if they were truly acts of betrayal. At that moment, after saying that, Felit spoke again and once more pressed Carl's to answer the question he had raised. Carl's, hearing this, responded that the third prince would answer it himself. But before that, he pointed out that Felit should at least offer a proper greeting to the third prince of the empire. Turvin also supported this, agreeing with Carl's stance. Gilrishin, upon hearing the two of them, thought to himself that they were more reliable than he had expected. As their words settled, Felit felt a sense of irritation at being corrected, yet he understood that he could not disregard what they had said, and so he complied. He bowed toward Gilrishin and formally introduced himself as the squad leader of the Special Task Force and the deputy to the commander, properly greeting the third prince. Gilrishin, after hearing this, told him that it was enough and instructed him to rise, and then he called out to Carl's and Turvin, informing them that he wished to speak with Felit alone, asking them to step aside for a moment. As the two moved away, Gilrishin then turned to Felit and remarked that it was good to meet him, and after that, he brought up how over the past few days the Vengeance Priest Corps had not even attempted to conceal their tracks, nor had they tried to create any real confusion. So someone of Felit's level should have already realized how unusual the situation was. He then went on to explain that the Priest Corps had only been misleading the pursuing troops from behind, and upon hearing that, Felit questioned why they would act in such a way. Gilrishin answered that it was because he had instructed them to do so, as he had been waiting specifically for Felit, which led Felit to ask why he would go to such lengths. Gilrishin then clarified that, first of all, he had not been kidnapped, which caused Felit to be taken aback, and he continued by stating that he intended to go to Orax together with the Vengeance Priest Corps, and for that he needed to meet Felit's superior, Marquis Elrenroyd. Seeing the look on Felit's face after hearing this, Gilrishin told him not to look at him as if he had lost his mind and insisted that he was not insane. Felit, hearing that, thought to himself that even for a madman there was a limit, and with that thought, he questioned whether Gilrishin's intentions meant that he was planning to betray the Empire. Gilrishin, hearing that, called out to Felit and questioned whether everything needed to be spelled out for him, which only left Felit more confused by what he meant. Gilrishin then shifted the topic and suggested that they should simply head to the gate and speak directly with Marquis Royd, and after saying that, he asked whether there was anything wrong with that approach, to which Felit admitted that there was not. Gilrishin, hearing that, felt satisfied that things were now back in order, and with that, he stated that it was late and that they should depart at dawn, but before that, he mentioned that he wanted to make one stop. Felit then asked where he was planning to go, and Gilrishin, with a faintly unsettling smile, replied that it was nothing much and that he simply intended to hunt a dangerous beast that had been troubling the citizens. But at the same time, he warned Felit that whether it was under the cover of night or not, neither he nor his men were to even think about attacking the Vengeance Priest Corps. Gilrishin then added that since Felit had served under Commander Royd for a long time, he must already know the secret regarding Karl's origins, And upon hearing that, Felit was visibly surprised that Gilrishan was aware of such information, which led him to question how he had come to know about it. However, before Felit could press further, Gilrishan cut him off and stated that they would let the matter slide for the night, as everything should remain calm and quiet. And with that, he asked whether Felit understood what he meant. After saying this, Gilrishan turned away and began walking off, and as he did, he instructed Felit to return with his subordinates at dawn. Felit, watching him leave and recalling the way Gilrishan had carried himself during their conversation, found himself questioning whether this was truly the same notorious prince he had known, as the behavior he had just witnessed felt completely different. He then began to wonder whether the rumors had been wrong all along, or if, perhaps, Gilrishan had simply lost his mind entirely. Moments later, the scene shifted to early morning, where Gilrishan could be seen standing outside, while looking up at the sky, and at that moment he was thinking about the swordsmanship that Marquis Elrenroyd used despite his paralyzed shoulder, realizing that it was none other than Trafalgar swordsmanship, a style that had been passed down by the knights of the old Luxon kingdom, which followed the principles of flowing swordplay, focused on defense and follow-up attacks, and could be used effectively regardless of the type of weapon wielded. It was a sword style that could be used regardless of weapon type, and while it was often said that a knight's sword was like a lover, for the Marquis, it went beyond that. His roaring sword was an ego sword that possessed a will of its own, and furthermore, it stood as a symbol of the head of the Royd family, which was why the Marquis never let go of his greatsword. As Gilrishan reflected on this, the system interface appeared and informed him that 4 skill points had been used, and that he had learned the nomadic crushing swordsmanship, a style born from the deep grudge of a nomadic tribe from the Western continent that pursued extreme principles of crushing swordplay. The system also notified him that he was now capable of performing basic sword techniques. Gilrishan, upon testing the newly acquired skill, felt a surge of excitement as he experienced how effective it was. At that moment, he considered that the Marquis Trafalgar swordsmanship was ranked at Grade B, while the nomadic crushing swordsmanship he had just learned was only Grade C, and although this difference in grade might make it seem inferior at first glance, that was not entirely true. He reflected that fast and aggressive swordplay could hold a relative advantage over softer, flowing styles, and when factoring in differences in sword types, the gap of a single grade could become negligible or even turn into an advantage, which was precisely what made the nomadic crushing swordsmanship so intriguing. The Luxon Kingdom, located in the far southern region, was a vassal state of the empire that strictly pursued a dominant style of swordsmanship and treated the nearby nomads like slaves, which eventually led to the nomads rising in anger and power, nearly bringing the kingdom to ruin. And although the nomads were ultimately defeated, they left behind the nomadic swift sword technique, a style created specifically to counter the Trafalgar swordsmanship. As Gilrishan reflected on this, Karl spoke up and noted that everyone had gathered, urging the third prince to get moving. And Gilrishan acknowledged this and said that he would follow right away. As he began walking, he thought to himself that even though the technique he had learned was only C rank, it would certainly prove useful later on. While thinking about this, he noticed ahead of him that 2 opposing sides were already facing each other, and at that moment he realized that the 2 groups did not get along at all. Gilrishan, starting to feel a sense of urgency, stepped in and tried to guide them, suggesting that instead of aiming for a few heavy strikes, it would be better to deal smaller amounts of damage consistently over time, and he asked if they understood his point, yet despite his explanation, it did not seem to register, as the 2 sides continued glaring at each other with clear hostility. At that moment, Gilrishan thought to himself that the situation had turned out to be more troublesome than expected, and he realized that he should have prepared for this beforehand, as he had originally planned to leave the raid in Urgel's hands. Yet Urgel was now standing there looking confused as to why Gilrishan was staring at him. Urgel then spoke up and suggested that Gilrishan should take charge himself, as it did not seem like anyone would listen to him. And upon hearing that, Gilrishan agreed that he was right. Gilrishan then called out to Karls and told him to strike him as hard as possible so that everyone would notice, but Karls hesitated and said that he could not bring himself to do such a thing. Gilrishan insisted that it was fine and that it was necessary for his survival. Even so, Karls remained reluctant until Gilrishan continued urging him. In the next moment, Karl suddenly struck Gilrishan directly in the face. Gilrishan, angered after being hit, complained that Karl should not have done it while he was still speaking. And as the impact drew everyone's attention toward him, Gilrishan used that moment to step forward and declare that he would personally command the raid, making it clear that once they entered, all internal conflict was to stop and that everyone was expected to follow his orders. Gilrishan, after saying that, added that if they refused to follow his instructions, then none of them would make it out alive, emphasizing just how dangerous the king of the Lockman Mountains truly was. He continued by stating that it did not matter whether they belonged to the Vengeance Priest Corps or the Special Forces Knights, as anyone who failed to follow his commands would die. And as he spoke, Vice Captain Feelit found himself recalling how earlier Gilrishin had claimed that the situation would not be anything serious, which only deepened his confusion. Gilrishin then concluded that he had already given enough explanation and made it clear that they would now proceed inside. Moments later, the group arrived at the boss lair, where the monster could be seen lying atop a pile of skulls from those it had killed and devoured. And even while remaining still, it seemed to sense something approaching, as if it had caught the scent of prey. Feelit, upon seeing the scene, was disturbed by the realization that the scattered remains were human bones, and he could not help but wonder how many people had been consumed by the creature. Feelit then concluded that there was no doubt about the situation and realized that the nearby monsters had been capturing humans and delivering them to this boss creature. And upon understanding this, he felt a deep sense of shame, as he could not believe that he had failed to notice anything until the situation had worsened to such a degree. And now he was forced to cooperate with those he once considered rebels in order to defeat it. He then spoke up again, expressing disbelief that such a monstrosity had existed without their knowledge. And with that, he declared that the Special Forces Knights would take full responsibility for their failure, and that they would now seek vengeance against the creature that had been devouring their citizens, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. And as he said this, his men stood in agreement with their vice captain before immediately charging toward the monster. Bamillo, upon hearing their resolve, responded that regardless of the outcome, vengeance would also be carried out by the priest corps, as their lord Elam demanded it. And with that, they too joined the charge. In that moment, all of them rushed forward and engaged the monster, exchanging heavy blows as the battle unfolded. And during the fight, Feelit recalled Gilrishin's earlier warning, realizing that the monster's eyes, despite appearing to be weak points, were not taking any damage. As this thought settled, Feelit called out to his men and instructed them to focus on cutting through the creature's tough outer skin first, and they all moved in agreement with that plan. As they began slashing at the monster, Carls remarked that it was just as expected from the Special Forces Knights, noting that each of them was individually powerful, while Turvin added that it was not only their swordsmanship, but also their speed, which rivaled that of the Vengeance Priest Corps. Gilrishin, hearing this, explained that although they were technically knights, they specialized more in ambushes and assassinations, and despite all of this, Gromhart remained seated. Gilrishin then thought to himself that clearing the first phase would not be difficult, as they had fast damage dealers, and their current team composition was ideal for handling it. However, the real issue lay in the second phase, which would begin the moment Gromhart stood up and uttered that specific line. As he was considering this, he suddenly noticed that Urgel was nowhere to be seen, which made him wonder where he had gone. And thinking further, he realized that Urgel was intentionally avoiding being read, which only reinforced his dislike for quick-witted individuals. Shifting his focus, Gilrishin instructed Turvin to prepare her spell in advance. As the battle continued, he then called out to everyone to retreat, and as they pulled back, Turvin activated her spell, informing him that it was ready before unleashing a powerful attack that struck the monster directly. However, the attack was not enough to bring Gromhart down, and in response, the monster began charging straight toward Turvin. Seeing it approach, Turvin froze in place, unable to move due to fear. But just as the monster was about to strike, the members of the Vengeance Priest Corps and the Special Forces Knights intervened, disrupting its attack and continuing their assault. Watching the flow of the battle, Gilrishin thought that things were progressing well and that everyone was performing as expected. Yet he also noted that in the second phase, Gromhart's physical resistance and natural recovery speed would increase significantly, making ordinary sword attacks ineffective as the monster would regenerate too quickly. Moments earlier, Bamillo had been surprised when he heard from Gilrishin that sword attacks would not work on the boss monster. He questioned whether such a thing was even possible. He then asked if the sword spirit would be effective. Gilrishin explained that using mana with the sword would be more effective. However, it would still not be enough. Bamillo, hearing that, asked how they were supposed to defeat the boss monster. Gilrishin told him not to worry. He added that the monster's magic resistance would decrease. It would also not be able to recover from magic attacks. He then explained that his master Turvin Sway, a 7th rank witch, would use her flame magic. Once that happened, the boss monster would charge at her. That would be the moment when Bamillo and the others needed to distract it. They had to hold it off until she was ready to cast her spell again. Because of that, Gilrishin advised that instead of relying on the sword spirit, they should use mana to move faster. After explaining all of that, He asked them if the plan was simple enough. Back in the present, the boss monster was being attacked repeatedly from all sides. As they saw this, they began to grow confident that they could defeat it. At that moment, one of the members of the Vengeance Priest Corps attacked carelessly. He struck the monster and boasted about his attack. He declared it as the strength of the rebels. This provoked the Imperial Forces Knights. They were not willing to back down. They began attacking more aggressively to prove their own strength. At that moment, Turvin had prepared another spell. However, as she was about to release it, she became confused. Both sides were taking turns attacking the monster. They were now blocking her path. Not knowing what to do, she called out to Gilrishan. If she cast the spell, everyone near the monster would also be hit. Gilrishan, observing the situation, grew confused. He wondered what was going on and why everyone had suddenly lost coordination. Gilrishan, in that moment, realized that the situation was turning unfavorable and that they could not continue dealing magic damage in this manner. He understood that if they reached the third phase like this, they would be in serious trouble. Acting quickly, he called out to Vice Captain Feelit and Archpriest Bamillo and questioned what they were doing. He told them to order their men to stop, explaining that the situation was no longer the same as before and that they would get hurt if they did not pull back. However, the two leaders were not willing to retreat so easily. Bamillo, in that moment, shouted toward the Imperial Forces Knights, telling them to fall back, insisting that they should have already realized that they could not match the strength of the Vengeance Priest Corps. Vice Captain Feelit, in response, declared that the Vengeance Priest Corps were nothing compared to the sword of the Imperial Forces Knights, and he instead ordered the opposition to withdraw. Gilrishan, hearing the two arguing, raised his voice and demanded to know what they were doing, telling them to stop provoking each other. However, it was already too late, as their coordination had completely broken down. In that moment, the monster took advantage of the chaos and managed to injure one of the men who was attacking it. At the same time, it began launching attacks of its own and started dealing heavy damage to everyone around it. Gilrishan, seeing that everything was slowly falling apart, thought to himself that if one had the right party during a raid, all that was needed was to move according to the patterns, which made things relatively easy, but a seasoned gamer would never let their guard down until the raid was completely over, because the moment the boss monster took control, the entire group could be wiped out instantly. Ironically, the men currently fighting had lowered their guard because they were not gamers, and to them, everything had started to feel too easy, and not only that, Gilrishan realized that even he had made the same mistake. So if they reached the third phase like this, it would not just be the others at risk, but he himself would also die. As he quietly tried to think of a way out, he felt that his mind was not functioning properly under the pressure. And while he was troubled, Carl suddenly grabbed his shoulders and with a bright expression reassured him that he did not need to worry, adding that he would stand as his sword and shield and that he was there to support him. And furthermore, he reminded him that both the Special Forces Knights and the Vengeance Priest Corps were elites in their own right, meaning they had faced situations like this many times before. Carls then added that he was glad to see Gilrishan returning to his former self, but he also pointed out that Gilrishan was trying to carry too much on his own, and if things ever became overwhelming, he should not hesitate to share that burden. And as he said this, he gave a light smile. Despite that, Gilrishan did not feel reassured at all, and instead thought to himself that Carl should not be saying such things, as it felt like he was setting himself up for something bad. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Feelit could be seen helping one of his men up while asking if he was all right, and after confirming that he was, he encouraged him to hold on a little longer. At that moment, Feelit realized that they could not continue like this, and he recalled that there were two key points in the third prince's strategy, the first being to keep the monster distracted from reaching Turvin's sway and ensuring that her magic attacks could land properly. And although they were attempting to do that, it was becoming increasingly difficult with fewer people, as many had already been injured and the rest were growing exhausted. And because of that, Feelit resolved that if they were to take revenge for the citizens who had lost their lives, then he needed to step forward and fulfill his role. At that moment, Feelit charged straight toward the monster, and as he closed the distance, he unleashed a powerful attack to draw its attention. And while doing so, he called out to Turvin, signaling that this was her chance to strike, and without hesitation, Turvin launched a strong spell that hit the monster directly. Feelit, seeing that her attack had landed, felt a sense of satisfaction. But almost immediately, the monster shifted its focus entirely onto him and began charging in his direction. Realizing the situation, Feelit understood that there was no longer enough time for him to escape, and he prepared himself to block the incoming attack. And just as he resolved to do so, he raised his guard and took the hit. But the force was overwhelming, and despite blocking it, he was severely injured and sent crashing to the ground. Lying there, Felix thought to himself that this might be the end for him. And as that realization set in, he reflected that it had been an honor to serve alongside his comrades all these years. Just as the monster was about to strike him again, Bamillo suddenly appeared and intervened at the last moment, saving him from the fatal blow. Felix, shocked by the sudden rescue, could only stare in surprise, while Bamillo spoke up and told him that there was no need for gratitude, adding that more importantly, the monster had likely targeted him because he had tried to stand out and fight it alone. Felix found himself at a loss for words after hearing that, while Bamillo added that it would be better for them to work together and fill the gap left by those who had been injured, and upon hearing that, Felix agreed with his suggestion. Meanwhile, the monster had just been struck once again by one of Turvin's attacks, and Gilrishan, seeing this, felt relieved that the attack had connected, and at the same time, he was pleased that Felix and Bamillo were now cooperating. Turvin, filled with confidence, called out to Gilrishan and told him to observe carefully, as this was what she considered true magic. At that moment, the monster suddenly became still, remaining motionless while an overwhelming aura began to pour out from its body. Gilrishan, seeing this, realized that the situation had reached a critical point, as they had somehow pushed the monster into its third phase, and he also thought that the earlier chaos had helped everyone regain their senses and return to their strategy. He then reflected that in the third phase, Gromheart would lose both its physical and magical resistance, while its damage output would increase as its health decreased, meaning it would abandon all defense and focus entirely on offense, and the target it would choose would be the weakest among them, which was undoubtedly Gilrishan himself due to his low level. At that moment, the system interface appeared and informed him that Gromheart's demonic eyes were fixed on him, and upon seeing this, Gilrishan immediately warned everyone that it was beginning and that they needed to prepare. Gromheart, filled with rage, reacted to being provoked by what it considered insignificant prey, and it prepared to tear each of them apart. But just as it was about to launch its attack, a massive spiked boulder from the ceiling suddenly broke loose and crashed down onto its back, killing it instantly. Witnessing this, Gilrishan was stunned and questioned how such a thing was even possible, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. The others, equally surprised, quickly realized that the monster had been defeated and began celebrating, while Gilrishan remained deep in thought, astonished that there were still things he did not know about this world. As in the game, the ceiling could never be used in such a way since it was not even visible during raids, meaning he had never considered that possibility, yet someone else clearly had, and at that moment, Gilrishan began to question who Urgel truly was. At that moment, as Urgel walked past him, Gilrishan called out and asked who he really was, and as he did so, he thought to himself that he might have no choice but to reveal his own identity, although he also considered that if Urgel was a player like him, then he would have already figured it out, and with that thought in mind, Gilrishan directly asked whether Urgel was also a player. Urgel, upon hearing that, simply smiled and responded with the same words Gilrishan had once said to him before, implying that there was no need to explain himself to someone he did not even know. And hearing that, Gilrishan immediately realized something about him, concluding that Urgel was nothing more than a petty individual. Moments later, they arrived at the entrance of Gromheart's treasure room, and as they looked inside, Felix remarked that there was nothing there, but Gilrishan questioned that claim and asked whether Felix truly saw nothing within. Felix, hearing that, recalled rumors that Gilrishan was fond of alcohol, and he began to think that perhaps Gilrishan was referring to something like that, which led him to ask whether he was talking about alcohol. As those words were spoken, Gilrishan addressed the area directly and called out to the individuals hiding behind the barrels, telling them to come out now that Gromheart had been defeated. At that moment, as the trapped people looked toward the one who had called out to them, they began to speak among themselves and realized who it was, believing that the man before them was none other than Elam, the god they had been speaking of, and with that belief, they rejoiced, thinking that they had been saved by the god himself. As those words spread, Bamillo stepped forward and clarified that he was not Elam, but merely his servant, a member of the great church of Elam, sent under the god's command to rescue them. But before he could finish, Felix stepped in and stated that he and his men were the Special Forces Knights and that they had also come to save them. However, upon hearing that, the survivors did not react with relief and instead showed clear dissatisfaction toward the Knights. One of the survivors then spoke up, revealing that he had once told his son that the Empire would come to save them, and he demanded to know why they had arrived so late, as because of that delay, his son had already been devoured by the monster. Overcome with anger, he questioned how they could act so proudly after arriving too late, and he asked whether they had any understanding of the suffering his son had endured and the pain he himself had felt watching his own child be eaten. Felix, hearing this, was left in shock and found himself unable to respond. The man, now with tears in his eyes, continued by saying that if they had come earlier, things could have been different, and he questioned what he was supposed to say to his son now. As his anger subsided into despair, he rejected their help entirely and told them to leave, and soon after, the other survivors echoed his words, declaring that they did not need the help of the Special Forces Knights and would rather die than accept it. Felix was deeply shaken by how the situation had turned out, and when one of his men suggested that they should withdraw for the time being, he remained frozen, repeatedly apologizing to the survivors for not arriving sooner. At that moment, Gilrishan stepped forward and addressed the survivors, explaining that the monsters of the Lockman Mountains had only recently begun acting aggressively, and that it had never been common for them to attack nearby villages, adding that under such circumstances, it would have been difficult for the Special Forces Knights to notice the threat in time. Gilrishan then added that he had coincidentally encountered the Vengeance Priest Corps, and together with the Special Forces Knights, they had managed to defeat Gromhard, and after saying that, he assured the survivors that he would personally meet with the commander of the Special Forces Knights to ensure that the monsters near the mountains were properly dealt with, and that they would do everything in their power to help the survivors recover from their losses. With that, Gilrishan lowered his head and apologized sincerely, stating that he knew nothing he could say would truly ease their pain, but he still wished to express his regret for everything they had suffered in the name of the Empire. Felix, witnessing this, was completely taken aback, unable to believe what he was seeing. At that moment, one of the survivors asked who Gilrishan was, and he introduced himself as Gilrishan Elro de Vault, the third prince of the Empire, which caused a wave of surprise among them, as they had not expected someone of his status to be present. Some of them mentioned that they had heard rumors of the third prince being a useless noble who spent his days drinking and causing trouble. Yet now they were seeing him bow his head before ordinary people like them, which left them conflicted. Another survivor remarked that if the prince himself had come, then it must mean that the Empire did care about them after all. Another added that upon thinking about it, the true enemy had always been the monster, and not the people before them. And with that realization, he tried to console the man who had lost his son, telling him to stay strong, as he himself had also suffered great loss, having lost his wife here and even his child years ago due to a natural disaster. The man then continued, saying that even if a father were to follow his son into death, he would not be able to face him with pride, and because of that, he acknowledged that while the situation was unbearably painful, those who had survived still had a responsibility to keep living on. He then tried to lift everyone's spirits by saying that he intended to collect stories while he was still alive so that he could share them with his family when he met them again, and he encouraged everyone, especially the grieving father, to endure and continue living. Meanwhile, Gilrishan, on the other hand, was lost in thought, realizing that there was not much to gain from defeating Gromhard, as it was a monster that preyed on humans and did not possess treasures that humans valued, which meant that this entire raid had merely served as preparation for what was to come next. He recalled that the true reward, the elixir of strength, a consumable capable of drastically boosting one's power, was hidden within the monster's eye, and saving the survivors had never been part of his original objective, which led him to question both the nature of this world and his own place within it. At that moment, the man who had lost his son spoke again and told Gilrishan to raise his head, saying that he was not like the nobles he had imagined, and that he could sense that Gilrishan was human just like the rest of them. And because of that, he asked if he could make one request. Gilrishan, hearing this, asked what it was, and the man replied that his son's name had been Holt, admitting that it was a simple name of a commoner, but he still pleaded with Gilrishan to remember it, and as he said this, he broke down in tears, begging him not to forget. Gilrishan, moved by this, took the man's hand and assured him that he would never forget the name. Moments later, the Special Forces Knights returned to their base, and Felix reported everything that had happened to Elrenroyd, who then asked him to confirm whether it was true that the third prince had seemed different, and whether that was the reason Felix had chosen to leave the rebels alone in the forest, to which Felix confirmed it was true. Royd then asked if it had been Felix's first time seeing the prince in person, and Felix, instead of replying verbally, simply nodded. He then added that the prince he had met was completely unlike the rumors, and that even the survivors had begun to say that he should become the next ruler. But before he could continue further, Royd cut him off, stating that he had heard enough nonsense for the day and ordering him to stop. Royd, in that moment, turned and walked away, and as he did so, he instructed Felix to focus on taking care of the survivors, while he himself would go and meet the third prince personally. Meanwhile, inside a tent at the base camp, the three were still engaged in conversation when Royd entered and apologized to Gilrishan for keeping him waiting, but Gilrishan responded by pointing out that Royd had said it would only take a moment, yet it had taken much longer than expected. Roy then shifted the topic and mentioned that he had heard some remarkable things from the vice captain. And as he spoke, he noticed that Carls was acting strangely, prompting him to ask if something was wrong, to which Carls replied that everything was fine. Roy gave a gentle smile at that response and expressed relief that Carls was unharmed. But as his attention returned to Gilrishan, his expression hardened once again. Taking a seat, Roy asked directly whether Gilrishan intended to go to Orax, and Gilrishan replied that he understood Roy's concerns but insisted that he intended to change, and in order to do so, he needed to reach Orax. As he continued, Gilrishan began to say what he would do if Roy tried to stop him, but before he could finish, Roy interrupted and asked him outright what he planned to do in that situation, and Gilrishan answered without hesitation that he would cut Roy down if he stood in his way. Hearing that, Roy questioned whether Gilrishan had lost his mind, and after a brief pause, he stated that even as a joke, such words were excessive, reminding him with clear authority that he was a swordmaster. He further explained that while Gilrishan might not understand the significance due to his lack of knowledge about swordsmanship, only 3 knights in the Empire had ever reached the 9th rank, and he was one of them. And with that, he fixed his gaze on Gilrishan and demanded to know how exactly he intended to defeat him. Roy then made his stance clear, stating that he had no intention of allowing Gilrishan to go to Orax, and that he would instead send him back to the palace while also eliminating all the rebels hiding within the forest. Gilrishan, upon hearing that, rose to his feet and formally declared that as a member of the Vault family, he was requesting a duel with the head of the Roy family. And with that, he instructed Roy to follow him outside. He then pressed further, questioning what was holding Roy back and whether his injured shoulder was the reason, even going as far as to ask if he was afraid. Roy, visibly irritated, responded that he did not know how Gilrishan had learned about his condition, but if the intention had been to provoke him, then it had clearly succeeded, and with that, he declared that Elrin of the Roy family accepted the challenge. Moments later, they stood outside, and Roy asked what rules would govern the duel, while Gilrishan, hearing this, observed him carefully and thought to himself that Roy's tone carried not even the slightest hint of doubt or fear, which made it clear that Roy believed there was no possible way he could lose, regardless of whatever strategy Gilrishan might attempt. As Gilrishan thought about it, he called out to Carls and began laying out the rules, stating that first, the duel would be conducted using only pure swordsmanship with all magic strictly excluded, second, that no armor would be allowed, and third, that the moment either of them dropped their sword, it would be considered an immediate loss, and after declaring these conditions, he asked Roy whether they were acceptable. Roy, hearing the rules, showed no objection and agreed without hesitation. At that moment, a system notification appeared before Gilrishan, informing him that a sudden event titled the Nobles' Duel had been triggered, and that his objective was to defeat Elrin Roy and claim victory.